So our second query is also going to be an inner join. So is our third query. For the second and the third query, we are going to be giving our tables alias names, and we're going to use the alias in the query. So we'll come down here, and this is beginning task number 2. And I'm going to kind of move my closing comment down. And for the first query that utilizes table aliases, this is almost going to be identical to the query we did in task 1. So to save ourselves a little bit of typing time, I'm actually going to copy this and paste it. And then we're going to enter an alias for the tables. Now, why would you want to use an alias? You would want to use an alias to save you some typing time. In a very long and involved select statement where you have lots of columns, and let's say the column names are the same and you have to prefix things with the table name, using aliases is going to save you a ton of time. So we're going to give vendors an alias of V, and we're going to give invoices an alias of I. So the as clause is used for an alias. It does not matter if you're giving a column name an alias or a table an alias, it's the same clause. Okay, followed by whatever alias you want to use. Now, looking at this, once we put the alias in, we have a little problem with vendors and invoices. If you remember, vendor ID is the column that is the same in both tables. Well, now we've given the tables an alias. So instead of using vendors, we have to use V. And instead of using invoices, we have to use I. Okay? And that resolves the problem. Now, do we need to put the table name in front of invoice number and vendor name? No, we don't, because we look under invoices and vendors, invoice numbers only in invoices. Vendor name only appears in vendors. You may want to put the prefix in front of the columns only to make them self-documenting. Okay, so if somebody was looking at this and let's say they didn't want to open up the database and open up the tables, they're just looking, well, you can easily see that invoice number is coming from invoices and vendor name is coming from vendors. So putting the table prefix in does make your select statement self-documenting. And a lot of people will use the alias and the prefix for exactly that reason. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to run this. Okay, and you're not going to notice any difference in results. It's the same exact query as we did before. We're just using table aliases now. So we're going to move our closing comment to the end there, and we are going to do another query that utilizes a table alias. So for this one, we're still using AP. And we'll do our select without anything after it. We're going to add our columns after we specify the tables. And so our table 1 is invoices. So we're going to say from invoices. And we're going to give it an alias of I. And we're going to join that with invoice line items. We're going to give that an alias of LI for line items. And we'll go ahead and tell it how we're joining. We're going to join on. invoice ID. Invoice ID is in both tables. The invoices table uses invoice ID as the primary key. The line item table uses it as a foreign key. Invoices is table 1. Line items is table 2. So we're going to say I.invoice ID is equal to li.invoice ID. And at this point, we're going to come back up here and tell SQL Server which columns we want to display. And we want invoice number from the invoices table. So we're going to do I dot, and let's choose invoice number. And from the invoice line items, we're going to choose invoice line item amount. So we're going to do li dot invoice line item amount. And we want invoice line item description, which is also in the line item table. And so you can see how nice it is to be able to key in the table in a dot and select the name from a list, especially when your column names are this long, because it's super easy to make a typo. Okay? And if you did not use the prefix, let me get rid of this one. You'd have to type quite a bit before it could figure out what table you wanted to use. If you use the prefix, okay, with the table alias, it knows exactly what table you want, and it displays all of the columns. Okay, so even though you don't have to use that table prefix in the select itself, if your columns are uniquely named, I would still use the prefix because it just makes your life easier. Because the minute you key in the prefix and a dot, it knows what table you want, it displays the columns, and you can simply pick one from the list rather than trying to type it. So at this point, we have invoice number from our invoice table. Invoice line item amount and invoice description is coming from invoice line items, which is table 2. It's only going to display the rows if the invoice ID is a match, which kind of makes sense, right? Why would we want to see invoice items and descriptions and amounts if the invoice number is different? We only want to see the items for the given invoice. So what we want with all of this is we only want to see invoices for account number 540. So this would be a customer. And they could have multiple invoices. We want to see all of their invoices, all of the line items that go with each of the invoice. And then we want to sort this by the invoice date. So it's going to be in invoice date order. Okay, and we should be able to go ahead and run this. Oops. Order by. Always is helpful if you key in your command correctly, and there it is. Now, it's not showing invoice date, as you can see. So if we were to add that to our select and run it, you could verify that it is sorted in invoice date order. Okay, once we verify that, we can go ahead and zap the ending off. And that pretty much completes our select statement. So we're going to move our closing down here, and we are going to save our changes. What we want to call this thing is Chapter 4 Textbook Assignment, and it's going to put the sequel on the end. And I already had mine out there, so I am going to replace what I have with this new one. For you guys, you aren't going to have to do that. When you save it the first time, it is going to have your Save As box. You're going to key in the name. If you're on campus, make sure that you're putting it on your Q drive. And if you're at home, saving to documents is fine. In fact, saving it to documents or a jump drive is always okay, as long as you know how to navigate to the drive and find your file so you can turn it in.